General Kethvar activated the holographic display with a gesture that sent phantom pain shooting through his reconstructed arm. The star chart expanded, showing the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet's original formation as they approached the Sol system 6 months ago. 10,000 vessels arranged in the classical Zephyrian battle formation, a sight that had brought civilizations to their knees across 3 galactic arms. We entered their system with complete confidence, Kethvar began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Our intelligence reports painted a picture of a species barely worthy of our attention. Humans had achieved faster-than-light travel only 73 years prior, their technology was crude by our standards, and their military doctrine appeared to be based on antiquated concepts of territorial warfare. The hologram shifted, showing detailed scans of Earth's military installations. Ancient aircraft carriers floating on liquid water, ground-based missiles that used chemical propulsion, soldiers who still required atmospheric breathing apparatus for space operations. To the assembled council, it looked like a museum display of primitive warfare. Fleet Admiral Zethmorn laughed when he saw these images. Kethvar continued, and several council members shifted uncomfortably at the mention of the late Admiral's name. He called it pest control and assigned the operation to his youngest sub-commanders as a training exercise. The plan was simple. Establish orbital dominance, disable their communications networks, and demand surrender. Standard procedure for integrating a new species into the coalition. The general paused, his 4 eyes focusing on Admiral Scythera. You ask how primitives defeated us. The first lesson I learned is that humans do not think like us. When faced with an obviously superior enemy, every civilized species attempts to negotiate, to find terms that minimize casualties. Humans? They started shooting before we finished broadcasting our surrender demands. The hologram shifted again, showing the opening moments of the battle. Small, angular craft launched from hidden installations across Earth's surface and from concealed positions throughout the asteroid belt. They moved with none of the graceful curves of proper starcraft, looking more like flying chunks of industrial machinery than warships. We initially ignored these launches, Kethvar admitted, his voice carrying the weight of that fateful decision. Our shields were rated against Coalition energy weapons. These primitive kinetic projectiles shouldn't have posed any threat to vessels of our class. He gestured, and the display zoomed in on one of the approaching human craft. Its design was brutal in its efficiency, nothing more than engines, guidance systems, and a massive payload of what appeared to be refined metal ingots. The first impact struck the heavy cruiser Magnificent Dawn. A single human projectile, moving at a significant fraction of light speed, carrying no exotic energy systems, no quantum disruption fields, no gravitic warheads. Just dense metal accelerated to incredible velocity. The simulation showed the moment of impact. The Magnificent Dawn, a vessel 3 kilometers long and shielded by the finest defensive systems Coalition technology could provide, simply ceased to exist in a brilliant flash of released kinetic energy. The human projectile converted its entire mass to energy on impact, Kethvar explained to the stunned silence. They had somehow calculated the exact velocity needed to overcome our shields through pure kinetic force, but that wasn't the lesson. The lesson was what happened next. The display pulled back to show the fleet's reaction. Ships began moving into defensive formations, energy weapons charging, commanders shouting orders across communication channels. Standard military doctrine, executed with the precision that had won the Coalition a dozen wars. While we were repositioning to counter this new threat, the humans launched their second wave. But these weren't kinetic projectiles. They were decoys, thousands of them, each broadcasting signals designed to mimic their actual weapons. Our targeting computers were overwhelmed trying to distinguish between real threats and false ones. Admiral Vrextile of the Andromedan Defense Force leaned forward. Surely your sensor operators could distinguish between active and passive targets? Kethvar's expression darkened. That assumes human decoys were passive. They weren't. Each false target carried just enough mass and shielding to look identical to their weapons until the moment of impact. They forced us to treat every single contact as a legitimate threat. The hologram showed the Coalition fleet's formation beginning to collapse as ships spread out to avoid the incoming swarm of potential threats. What had been a coordinated battle formation became scattered individual vessels, each captain making independent decisions about which targets to engage. This is when the humans revealed their third surprise. Kethvar continued. Hidden among the decoys were something they called stealth bombers. Spacecraft so small our sensors dismissed them as debris, coated in materials that absorbed our scanning beams. Each one carried a single pilot and a payload specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in our ship designs. The display highlighted several tiny contacts that had gone unnoticed during the initial attack. As the simulation progressed, these minute craft approached coalition vessels and released their payloads, not at the heavily armored hulls, but at sensor arrays, communication dishes, and shield projectors. They weren't trying to destroy our ships, Kethvar explained. They were blinding and deafening us. Within 20 minutes of first contact, half our fleet had lost primary sensors and communications. We were fighting blind against an enemy that seemed to know exactly where to hurt us most. Commander Kethlin of the Regelian Home Guard spoke up. But surely your ship's automated systems could compensate for sensor loss? You would think so, Kethvar replied grimly. But the humans had studied our technology more thoroughly than we realized. Their payloads weren't random explosives. They were specifically designed electromagnetic pulse weapons that targeted the quantum processing cores of our computer systems. Not powerful enough to destroy them, but precisely calibrated to cause cascading errors in our targeting and navigation systems. The hologram showed coalition warships beginning to fire wildly at phantom targets, their weapon systems confused by corrupted sensor data. Some ships collided with their own allies as navigation computers provided false position information. The perfect military formation dissolved into chaos. But this still wasn't the worst of it, Kethvar said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Because while we were dealing with kinetic weapons, decoys, stealth attacks, and electronic warfare, the humans launched their psychological offensive. The display changed to show intercepts of human communications channels. Instead of the disciplined military chatter the coalition expected, the channels were filled with something far more unsettling. Music, laughter, and casual conversation. Human pilots were discussing weekend plans, sharing jokes, and requesting permission to name their kills after ancient Earth entertainment figures. They were having fun, Kethvar said, and the words hung in the air like an accusation. While our crews were panicking, while our commanders were screaming orders, while our ships were dying around us, the humans were enjoying themselves. They treated the destruction of our fleet like some kind of recreational activity. Admiral Zethara's tentacles writhed with agitation. That's impossible. No civilized species approaches warfare with such casual disregard for life. Civilized. Kethvar repeated the word like it tasted bitter. That was our fundamental error. We assumed humans would fight like civilized beings. But humans don't see war as a political tool or a test of honor. They see it as problem-solving, and they approach problems with creativity, enthusiasm, and complete disregard for conventional limitations. The general activated another display, showing the aftermath of the first day's combat. Of the 10,000 ships that had entered the Sol system, nearly 2,000 were gone. Not captured, not disabled, but completely destroyed. The survivors were scattered, their formations broken, their communication networks compromised.
Fleet Admiral Zethmorn called for a strategic withdrawal to regroup. Kethvar continued.
He assumed the humans had expended their best weapons in the initial attack, and that a coordinated assault would overwhelm their defenses. He was wrong. The humans were just getting started. The hologram shifted to show human industrial facilities across Earth and throughout the solar system. Instead of shutting down production to focus on military output, these facilities had somehow increased their manufacturing capacity during the battle. While we were licking our wounds and planning our counterattack, the humans were building more weapons. Not over weeks or months, but in hours. Their entire industrial base had been converted to military production in the time it took us to count our casualties. Kethvar gestured to data streams showing human manufacturing output. They call it total war, and it means exactly what it sounds like. Every human, every facility, every resource dedicated to a single purpose: our destruction. They don't have soldiers and civilians, they have warriors and support personnel. Every human became part of their war machine. The general's voice grew quieter, more haunted. But the most terrifying thing wasn't their industrial capacity or their tactical innovations. It was their attitude. When we monitored their communications, expecting to find fear or desperation, we found something far worse. They were excited. The prospect of fighting an enemy with superior technology didn't terrify them. It thrilled them. He activated a recording, and the chamber filled with human voices intercepted during the battle. The translation protocols rendered their words in standard coalition language, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. Finally, something interesting to shoot at. Did you see that battleship pop? Looked like a firework. Betty's buying the first round when we get home. I just bagged my third capital ship. The recording ended, and the council chamber fell silent, except for the nervous clicking of chitin on armor and the soft whistle of various respiratory systems. This was just the first day, Kethvar said finally. We lost 2,000 ships, had our battle formation shattered, our communications disrupted, and our tactical doctrine proven inadequate. And the humans? They were planning their next surprise. The general straightened, drawing on the last reserves of his military bearing. What I'm about to tell you next will challenge everything you believe about warfare, about technology, and about the nature of intelligence itself. Because on the second day, the humans showed us that they had been holding back. The holographic display faded to black, leaving the council in darkness save for the emergency lighting strips along the walls. In that darkness, Kethvar's voice carried a weight that pressed against everyone present. They had been holding back, he repeated, because they wanted to see what we could do. They wanted to study us, to understand our capabilities, our weaknesses, our psychology. The first day wasn't a battle, it was an examination. And we had failed their test. The lights slowly returned, revealing faces marked by expressions ranging from disbelief to growing horror. Kethvar stood silently for a moment, letting the implications sink in. The humans have a saying, he concluded. They say that generals always fight the last war. We came to Seoul expecting to fight the kind of civilized conflict we understood, with rules and honor and predictable outcomes. Instead, we encountered a species that treats warfare as an art form, a science, and a form of entertainment. We learned too late that humans don't fight the last war. They invent entirely new ways to wage war. He paused at the podium, his scarred hands gripping its edges. Tomorrow, I will tell you about the second day, when the humans revealed their true nature. When they showed us what a species looks like when it has spent its entire evolutionary history fighting not just other members of its own species, but its very environment, its predators, its diseases, and sometimes reality itself. The general's 4 eyes swept across the assembled military leaders one final time. Prepare yourselves, honored council. What I have told you so far was merely their opening move. The real nightmare is yet to come. The second day began with what Fleet Admiral Zethmorn believed would be redemption. General Kethvar activated the holographic display, showing the remaining coalition forces arranged in a defensive sphere around one of Jupiter's moons, licking their wounds and planning their counterattack. The Admiral was convinced that the humans had revealed all their capabilities in the first engagement. Kethvar began, his voice carrying the bitter weight of hindsight. Our tactical computers had analyzed every human weapon system, every attack pattern, every technological innovation they had displayed. We believed we had adapted. The hologram showed coalition engineers working frantically to modify shield harmonics, recalibrate sensor arrays, and develop countermeasures for human electromagnetic pulse weapons. It was impressive work, the kind of rapid adaptation that had won the coalition wars against a dozen different species. We spent 18 hours preparing what we called the perfect counter, Kethvar continued. New formations designed to minimize kinetic impact damage, sensor networks hardened against electronic warfare, communication protocols that could function even with compromised quantum cores. Admiral Zethmorn declared it the finest example of coalition military engineering he had ever witnessed. The display shifted to show the human response during those same 18 hours. Instead of the frantic military buildup the coalition expected, human activity appeared almost casual. Ships moved in seemingly random patterns, industrial facilities maintained normal production schedules, and their communications remained filled with the same casual banter that had so unnerved coalition intelligence analysts. This should have been our second warning, Kethvar admitted. When facing an obviously superior enemy that had just lost 2,000 ships, any rational species would be mobilizing every available resource for defense. The humans appeared to be going about their normal business. Commander Kethlin leaned forward. Perhaps they were attempting to appear unconcerned to maintain morale? Kethvar's laugh was hollow. That's what our intelligence officers concluded. They interpreted human casual behavior as a psychological warfare tactic designed to project confidence they didn't actually possess. We were wrong. The humans weren't projecting false confidence. They were genuinely, terrifyingly confident. The hologram advanced to show the coalition's second assault. 8,000 ships arranged in the new formation, approaching Earth with what appeared to be textbook precision. Energy weapons charged, shields at maximum power, sensors actively scanning for the kinetic projectiles and stealth bombers that had caused such havoc the day before. The humans let us get within optimal firing range, Kethvar said, his voice growing quieter. We interpreted this as incompetence, proof that they had exhausted their long-range capabilities in the first battle. We prepared to unleash concentrated fire on their orbital installations and end this embarrassing conflict. The display showed coalition weapon systems powering up, targeting solutions being calculated. Commanders preparing to give the order that would reduce human civilization to radioactive debris. It should have been the moment of victory. Instead, something impossible happened. The humans disappeared, Kethvar said simply. The hologram showed the moment when every human signature on coalition sensors simply vanished. Ships, orbital platforms, industrial facilities, even the planet Earth itself seemed to fade from existence as if it had never been there. Our first assumption was technological failure, Kethvar explained. Massive sensor malfunction caused by some kind of human electronic warfare. But our sensors were functioning perfectly. They were accurately reporting that there was nothing there to detect. Admiral Vrextile's breathing apparatus wheezed with agitation. Cloaking technology on that scale is theoretically impossible. The energy requirements alone would exceed the total power output of most civilizations. Kethvar agreed. That's what our scientists said. Right up until the moment human weapons began firing from positions our sensors insisted were empty space. The hologram showed coalition ships suddenly erupting in explosions as weapons fire seemed to materialize from nowhere. Not the kinetic projectiles or electromagnetic pulse bombs of the first day, but something far more sophisticated. Directed energy weapons that appeared to be firing from multiple impossible directions simultaneously. The humans had developed what they called quantum stealth, Kethvar explained, though his tone suggested he still didn't fully understand it. Not simple light bending or sensor jamming, but actual manipulation of quantum probability fields. They hadn't hidden their ships. They had made them temporarily non-existent in our frame of reference. The display zoomed in on one of the human weapons, a beam of coherent energy that seemed to bend and twist through space in ways that violated everything the Coalition understood about physics. When it struck Coalition vessels, the results were unlike anything their scientists had ever recorded. Their weapons didn't just damage our ships, Kethvar said, his voice barely above a whisper. They damaged the fundamental structure of reality around our ships. Hulls didn't melt or explode. They simply ceased to follow the laws of physics. We watched entire sections of our vessels phase in and out of existence, their crews screaming as they experienced dimensions that shouldn't exist. General Zik, Sagandra of the Polarian Star Guard, made a sound that might have been skeptical if it hadn't been tinged with growing horror. You're describing technology that violates the basic principles of quantum mechanics. Yes, Kethvar agreed. That's exactly what I'm describing. The humans had somehow weaponized quantum uncertainty itself, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing that this wasn't new technology they had developed in response to our invasion. They had been working on it for decades. The hologram shifted to show intercepts of human communications during the battle. Instead of technical discussions about their impossible weapons, the channels were filled with references to Project Philadelphia, Manhattan Plus, and other codenames that suggested a long-term research program. They had been preparing for us, Kethvar said, his words hanging in the chamber like an accusation. Not for our specific invasion, but for the possibility of alien contact in general. While we were exploring the galaxy, establishing trade routes, and building civilization, the humans were asking themselves a single question: what if someone tries to conquer us? The display showed human research facilities hidden in asteroid belts, underwater installations on Earth, and orbital laboratories disguised as communication satellites. The scope of their military research program dwarfed anything the Coalition had ever imagined from a supposedly primitive species. They call it defense in depth, Kethvar continued. Not just military defense, but technological, psychological, and even philosophical defense. They had war-gamed scenarios involving enemies with superior technology, greater numbers, and unknown capabilities. They had spent decades developing counters to threats that didn't yet exist. Admiral Theothara's tentacles writhed nervously. But surely such extensive military preparation would have been detected by our intelligence services? You would think so, Kethvar replied grimly. But the humans had developed what they called compartmentalization. No single individual, facility, or even government knew the full extent of their capabilities. Research was distributed across thousands of locations, each working on seemingly innocent civilian projects that could be rapidly converted to military applications. The hologram showed the devastating effectiveness of this approach. As coalition forces engaged what they thought were the primary human defenses, backup systems came online from locations that hadn't even registered as military targets. Civilian asteroid mining operations revealed themselves as weapons platforms. Scientific research stations began manufacturing exotic ammunition. Even human entertainment facilities converted to military production. We weren't fighting a military, Kethvar realized aloud, voicing a conclusion that had taken him months to understand. We were fighting an entire civilization that had spent generations preparing for war against unknown enemies. The display showed the second day's casualties mounting with horrifying speed. Coalition ships didn't just explode or shut down. They were transformed into things that shouldn't exist. Crews reported hull breaches that opened into dimensions filled with impossible colors, engineering sections where gravity flowed sideways and time moved backward, command centers where cause and effect operated in reverse. Our medical teams couldn't treat injuries caused by weapons that violated physics, Kethvar said, his voice growing hoarse. How do you heal a wound that exists in 11 dimensions? How do you perform surgery on a patient whose molecular structure phases in and out of reality? The chamber fell silent, except for the sound of various breathing apparatuses and the nervous clicking of chitin on armor. The assembled military leaders were beginning to understand that they weren't hearing about a conventional defeat. But even this wasn't the humans' final surprise for the second day, Kethvar continued, his scarred hands gripping the podium. As our forces retreated in complete disorder, our sensors detected something that our tactical computers initially dismissed as impossible. The hologram shifted to show long-range scans of the outer solar system. What appeared to be massive construction projects were rapidly taking shape, structures so large they dwarfed anything in the Coalition's engineering capabilities. The humans were building something, Kethvar said. During the battle, while their impossible weapons were dismantling our fleet, their industrial base was constructing what appeared to be artificial structures around their star. Not orbital platforms or space stations, but engineering projects on a stellar scale. The display zoomed in to show the beginnings of what looked like a ring of structures being assembled around the sun itself. The construction rate was impossible by Coalition standards, suggesting either technology far beyond their current capabilities or industrial capacity that defied rational calculation. We initially assumed these were defensive installations, Kethvar explained. Fortress platforms designed to protect their home system from future invasion attempts. Our intelligence analysts calculated that such structures would make the Sol system virtually impregnable. He paused, his four eyes focusing on the assembled council members. We were wrong again. The humans weren't building defenses, they were building weapons. Weapons designed not to protect their home system, but to take the war directly to us. The hologram showed Coalition intelligence projections of the human construction projects. The structures appeared to be designed to harness and focus stellar energy on a scale that would make them capable of sterilizing entire star systems from interstellar distances. They call them Nicole Dyson lasers, Kethvar said, pronouncing the human words with difficulty. Stellar engineering projects that convert their star into a weapon capable of targeting enemies across galactic distances. While we were planning our next assault, they were preparing to bring the fight to our homeworlds. General Zixandra made a sound of disbelief. The energy requirements for such construction would require dismantling entire planets. Yes, Kethvar agreed, and that's exactly what they were doing. While fighting us with one hand, they were simultaneously dismantling their outer planets with the other, converting the raw materials into construction materials for weapons that could threaten our entire civilization. The display showed automated mining operations stripping Mercury to its core, mass drivers launching processed materials toward the construction sites, and manufacturing facilities working at capacities that suggested either complete automation or total population mobilization. This is when Admiral Zethmorn made his final mistake, Kethvar said, his voice carrying the weight of inevitable tragedy. He decided that the human construction projects represented an existential threat to the Coalition that justified any response, including the use of weapons banned by every interstellar treaty. The hologram showed Coalition vessels moving into bombardment positions, their most powerful weapons charging for an attack designed to render Earth completely lifeless. It should have been overkill, the kind of devastating assault that would end the conflict immediately. The Admiral ordered the deployment of quantum cascade torpedoes, Kethvar said, and several council members recoiled at the mention of weapons so destructive they were considered crimes against existence itself. Devices designed to unravel the fundamental forces holding matter together. Not just city killers or planet crackers, but weapons that could theoretically destroy entire star systems. The display showed the torpedoes launching from Coalition vessels, their exotic warheads designed to create an unstoppable chain reaction that would reduce the Sol system to high-energy particles. It was the Coalition's ultimate weapon, held in reserve for threats to civilization itself. The torpedoes never reached their targets, Kethvar said quietly. Halfway to Earth, they simply stopped. Not destroyed, not deflected, but frozen in space as if time itself had stopped moving around them. The hologram showed the impossible sight: weapons designed to destroy reality itself, suspended motionless in space while everything else continued to function normally. Coalition sensors could detect them, could even communicate with their guidance systems, but the torpedoes themselves existed in a state of temporal suspension.
The humans had somehow isolated sections of space-time, Kethvar explained, though his tone suggested he still didn't believe it himself.
They had created temporal bubbles where our weapons existed in a state of permanent stasis, not destroyed, not disarmed, but removed from the flow of causality itself. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. A species that could manipulate time itself was beyond anything the Coalition had ever encountered. That was the moment, Kethvar said, his voice barely audible, when Admiral Zethmorn finally understood what we were facing. Not a primitive species that had gotten lucky, not a civilization with one or two unexpected technologies, but something that had evolved in an environment so hostile that they had been forced to develop capabilities we couldn't even comprehend.
The holographic display faded, leaving the Council in emergency lighting that cast harsh shadows across their faces.
The second day ended with our forces in complete retreat, Kethvar concluded, not because we had been defeated in battle, but because we had encountered an enemy that operated by rules we didn't know existed. We had lost not just ships and personnel, but our fundamental understanding of what warfare could be. He straightened, preparing to continue his account. But the humans weren't finished with us. The second day had been their defensive demonstration. The third day, they showed us what human offensive capabilities looked like. The general's scarred hands relaxed their grip on the podium slightly. Prepare yourselves, honored council. What I have described so far was merely them protecting their home. Tomorrow, I will tell you what happened when they decided to hunt us. The third day began with silence. General Kethvar activated the holographic display, showing the scattered remnants of the Coalition fleet drifting in the outer reaches of the Sol system, their commanders trying to process the impossibility of what they had witnessed. We had pulled back beyond the orbit of Pluto, Kethvar began, his voice carrying exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. 6,000 ships remaining from our original 10,000, their crews traumatized by encounters with weapons that violated everything we thought we knew about reality. The hologram showed Coalition vessels in defensive formations, their energy signatures dim as crews attempted to repair systems damaged by exposure to impossible physics. Medical bays were filled with personnel suffering from injuries that defied treatment, and engineering sections struggled with equipment that occasionally forgot how to obey basic physical laws. Admiral Zethmorn had called for a strategic withdrawal to Coalition space, Kethvar continued. He planned to return with reinforcements, siege equipment, and specialists who might understand human technology well enough to counter it. It was a sound decision, the kind of tactical flexibility that had won wars against superior enemies in the past. The display showed the beginnings of the withdrawal, Coalition ships powering up their hyperdrive systems and preparing to retreat to friendly territory. It should have been a routine military maneuver, the kind of strategic repositioning that any competent commander would execute under similar circumstances. The humans had other plans, Kethvar said quietly. The hologram shifted to show long-range sensors detecting movement throughout the Sol system. Human ships, previously hidden by their quantum stealth technology, began revealing themselves in numbers that defied Coalition intelligence estimates. We had assumed their fleet consisted of perhaps a few hundred vessels, Kethvar explained. Our surveillance had detected manufacturing facilities capable of producing modest numbers of spacecraft, and their industrial capacity seemed consistent with a civilization that had achieved faster-than-light travel less than a century ago. The display updated to show the true scope of human naval forces. Thousands of ships emerged from hiding places throughout the solar system, their designs ranging from the crude kinetic weapons platforms of the first day to vessels that appeared to be constructed from materials that shouldn't exist. They had been building a fleet for decades, Kethvar said, his voice filled with a mixture of admiration and horror. Not just military vessels, but exploration ships, research platforms, industrial craft, even what appeared to be colonization vessels. While we were establishing trade routes and diplomatic relations with other species, the humans were preparing for war on a scale that encompassed their entire civilization. Admiral Vrextal shifted uncomfortably in his environmental suit. But surely our sensors would have detected such massive construction projects? You would think so, Kethvar agreed. But the humans had developed what they called distributed manufacturing. Instead of building large shipyards that could be easily detected, they had converted their entire industrial base to spacecraft production. asteroid mining operations that doubled as ship construction facilities, orbital manufacturing platforms disguised as communication satellites, even civilian transportation networks that could be rapidly converted to military logistics. The hologram zoomed in on several human vessels, revealing designs that challenged every principle of spacecraft engineering the Coalition understood. Ships that appeared to be constructed from crystallized space-time, vessels whose hulls flickered between different states of matter, and craft that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously.
Their ships weren't just technologically advanced, Kethvar said, his four eyes focusing on details that still haunted his sleep.
They were evolutionary. Each vessel appeared to be a unique experiment in warfare, a test platform for weapons and technologies we couldn't even classify. The display showed one particular human ship that caught the attention of several council members. It appeared to be constructed entirely from what looked like weaponized mathematics. Its hull covered in equations that seemed to rewrite themselves as they watched. That one called itself Probability Storm, Kethvar said, noting their attention. Its primary weapon was uncertainty itself. It could fire events that might happen, forcing enemy ships to defend against attacks that existed only as mathematical possibilities. General Zixandra made a sound of disbelief. That's not possible. You can't weaponize abstract concepts. That's what our physicists said, Kethvar replied grimly, right up until Probability Storm attacked the battleship Eternal Glory with a barrage of maybe explosions. The ship spent 3 hours randomly exploding and unexploding as reality tried to decide whether the attack had actually occurred. The hologram shifted to show the beginning of the human offensive. Instead of the coordinated fleet movements the Coalition expected, human ships moved in patterns that seemed random, chaotic, even self-destructive. Some vessels appeared to be attacking their own allies, while others moved in formations that violated basic tactical doctrine. We initially interpreted this as evidence of poor military coordination, Kethvar explained. Our tactical computers calculated that human fleet movements were so disorganized they would be vulnerable to concentrated assault. We were wrong again. The display zoomed in to show what was actually happening. Human ships weren't moving randomly. They were implementing tactics that existed in dimensions the Coalition couldn't perceive. Vessels that appeared to be attacking each other were actually coordinating attacks through higher dimensional space, while formations that looked chaotic were actually optimized for battlefield conditions that hadn't yet occurred. They called it four-dimensional chess, Kethvar said, struggling with the human concepts. Military strategy that incorporated not just spatial positioning and timing, but probability manipulation and temporal mechanics. They weren't just fighting us in the present, they were fighting us across multiple possible futures simultaneously. The hologram showed the devastating effectiveness of these impossible tactics. Coalition ships found themselves under attack from directions that didn't exist, defending against weapons that fired backwards through time, and engaging enemies that existed only as probability distributions until the moment of impact. Our fleet formations, perfected through centuries of warfare, became liabilities, Kethvar continued. Every tactical doctrine, every strategic principle, every hard-won lesson about space combat became a vulnerability that the humans could exploit. The display showed Coalition vessels attempting to respond to human attacks, their weapons firing at targets that phased in and out of existence, their defensive systems overwhelmed by assaults that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. But the humans' most devastating weapon wasn't their impossible technology, Kethvar said, his voice growing quieter. It was their psychology. They had spent their entire evolutionary history as persistence predators, creatures that hunted by simply refusing to give up. And they brought that mentality to interstellar warfare. The hologram showed human ships continuing to attack even after sustaining damage that should have been crippling. Vessels with their hulls breached, their crews exposed to vacuum, their weapons systems failing, continued to press their assaults with a determination that defied rational explanation. We watched human pilots eject from destroyed spacecraft and continue fighting with personal weapons, Kethvar said, his voice filled with unwilling respect. Crew members whose ships had been reduced to debris fields somehow managed to continue coordinating attacks using emergency communication systems. Even when their vessels were completely destroyed, humans found ways to keep fighting. The display showed one particularly disturbing example: a human ship that had been cut in half by Coalition energy weapons, its crew compartments exposed to space, continuing to fire its weapons, while its surviving crew members worked to keep the ship operational, using nothing but emergency life support. They called it fighting until the last round, Kethvar explained. Not just individual determination, but institutional commitment to warfare, that persisted regardless of casualties or tactical situation. They had programmed their entire military culture around the concept that surrender was not an option. Admiral Scythara's tentacles writhed with agitation. Such fanatical dedication is the mark of an irrational species. Surely they would recognize when continued resistance was futile. That assumes humans think like us, Kethvar replied. But humans don't see futile resistance as irrational. They see it as tactical opportunity. Every moment they continue fighting is another chance to learn about their enemy, to develop new strategies, to find weaknesses that can be exploited.
The hologram shifted to show intercepts of human military communications during the battle.
Instead of the desperation or fanaticism the coalition expected, the channels were filled with tactical analysis, innovative problem-solving, and what could only be described as professional enthusiasm. "Listen to this," Kethvar said, activating an audio recording. "Alpha Squad, we've confirmed that their shield harmonics can't compensate for resonance frequencies above 7 terahertz. Recommend focusing fire on their sensor arrays to force them to rely on backup systems." "Copy that, Alpha." Beta Squad is reporting success with quantum entanglement mines. Their point defense systems can't target weapons that exist in superposition states. Outstanding work, Beta. Charlie Squad, try using temporal displacement on your next attack run. If we can hit them 3 seconds before we fire, their countermeasures won't have time to adapt. The recording ended, leaving the council chamber in stunned silence. "They were learning from us," Kethvar said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every attack we made, every defensive measure we employed, every tactical decision we implemented became data for their analysis. They were treating the battle like a laboratory experiment, with us as the test subjects." The hologram showed the results of this approach. Human tactics evolved in real time as they identified coalition weaknesses, adapted their strategies to exploit newly discovered vulnerabilities, and developed countermeasures for defensive systems they had never encountered before. Within 6 hours, they had identified critical flaws in 17 different coalition technologies. Kethvar continued. Shield harmonics that could be disrupted by specific frequency combinations, sensor arrays vulnerable to quantum interference, weapon systems that could be overloaded by redirected energy feedback. The display showed coalition defenses crumbling as humans systematically dismantled every advantage the superior technology had provided. Ships that had been invulnerable to primitive weapons found themselves helpless against attacks specifically designed to exploit previously unknown weaknesses. But this still wasn't their most terrifying capability, Kethvar said, his scarred hands gripping the podium until his knuckles went pale. The humans had developed something they called adaptive warfare, not just learning from individual battles, but incorporating new knowledge into their entire military doctrine in real time. The hologram showed human forces across the Sol system simultaneously implementing tactical innovations discovered during the current battle. Lessons learned by one unit were instantly transmitted to all other forces, creating a military organization that evolved faster than its enemies could adapt. They had networked their entire fleet, Kethvar explained. Not just communication systems, but shared consciousness, distributed intelligence, collective tactical awareness. When one human pilot discovered an effective attack strategy, every other pilot instantly gained that knowledge. The display showed the exponential effect of this shared learning. Human effectiveness increased geometrically as each tactical innovation multiplied across their entire force structure, while coalition forces continued to fight as isolated units using outdated strategies. "We were facing an enemy that got smarter with every engagement," Kethvar said, his voice filled with growing horror. "Every casualty we inflicted taught them something new about our capabilities. Every defensive measure we employed showed them weaknesses they could exploit. We weren't winning battles, we were providing education." The hologram showed coalition fleet strength declining rapidly as human tactical efficiency increased. Ships that had survived the first 2 days fighting found themselves overwhelmed by attacks that seemed specifically designed to counter their individual defensive capabilities. "This is when Admiral Zethmorn made his final mistake," Kethvar said, his voice growing hoarse. He ordered a concentrated assault on Earth itself, believing that threatening human civilian populations would force them to negotiate. The display showed coalition forces moving toward the inner solar system, their most powerful weapons charging for a bombardment designed to devastate human population centers. It was a desperate gambit, the kind of terror tactic that had forced other species to surrender in previous conflicts. The humans' response was not what we expected, Kethvar said quietly. Instead of panic or negotiation attempts, human military communications filled with what could only be described as grim satisfaction. Their forces didn't move to intercept the coalition assault. They accelerated their own offensive operations. They welcomed the escalation, Kethvar realized aloud. The threat to their civilian population didn't terrify them. It liberated them. Every restriction on their military operations, every constraint imposed by the need to protect non-combatants, every limitation that civilized warfare requires simply vanished. The hologram showed human forces unleashing weapons that had apparently been held in reserve, devices that manipulated fundamental forces, weapons that attacked the concept of existence itself, and technologies that seemed to rewrite the basic laws of physics in localized areas. They called it total war, Kethvar said, his voice filled with unwilling awe. Not just military conflict, but the complete mobilization of their civilization for the purpose of destroying their enemies. Every human became a combatant. Every facility became a weapons platform. Every resource became ammunition in a war effort that encompassed their entire species. The display showed the results. Human industrial capacity increased beyond anything the Coalition had thought possible, while their military innovation accelerated to the point where new weapons technologies were being deployed faster than Coalition analysts could even identify them. The third day ended with our forces in full retreat, Kethvar concluded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute defeat. Not because we had been outfought in conventional terms, but because we had encountered a species that treated warfare as their natural state, technological innovation as their primary survival strategy, and the destruction of their enemies as their defining cultural characteristic. The holographic display faded, leaving the council chamber in emergency lighting that emphasized the shocked expressions on every face present. But the humans weren't content to simply drive us away, Kethvar said, his scarred hands relaxing their grip on the podium. The third day had shown them what we were capable of when pressed. The fourth day, they showed us what happens when humans decide that a threat must be permanently eliminated. He straightened, drawing on reserves of strength that came from duty rather than hope. Prepare yourselves, honored council. What I have described so far was them defending their territory and testing our capabilities. Tomorrow, I will tell you what happened when they decided we were too dangerous to be allowed to survive. The fourth day began with a single message that would haunt Kethvar for the rest of his existence. General Kethvar stood motionless at the podium for several moments before activating the holographic display, his four eyes reflecting a horror that had aged him decades in mere days. The message was transmitted on all Coalition frequencies simultaneously. Kethvar began, his voice hollow with the memory. Perfect translation in 17 different languages, broadcast from every human ship, platform, and installation in the Sol system. 7 words that changed everything we thought we understood about warfare. The hologram displayed the message in flowing Coalition script, each word appearing with mechanical precision. You have been judged. Sentence, complete extinction. Not surrender demands. Kethvar explained to the stunned silence. Not negotiation terms, not even threats of retaliation. A judicial verdict, delivered with the calm certainty of a court pronouncing sentence on a convicted criminal. Admiral Zithara's tentacles writhed with nervous energy. But surely this was psychological warfare, an attempt to demoralize your forces through intimidation? That's what Admiral Zethmorn believed, Kethvar replied grimly. He interpreted it as evidence that human morale was breaking, that they were resorting to empty threats because their military situation was becoming desperate.
He ordered our forces to ignore what he called primitive attempts at intimidation and continue with standard withdrawal procedures. The holographic display shifted to show Coalition fleet movements during the early hours of the fourth day. Ships arranged in defensive formations, preparing to jump to hyperspace, their crews focused on damage control and tactical reorganization. It was exactly the kind of professional military response that had served the Coalition well in previous conflicts. The humans gave us 12 hours, Kethvar continued, his voice growing quieter. 12 hours to complete our withdrawal, to jump to hyperspace, to remove our forces from their system. They made no attempt to interfere with our preparations, launched no attacks against our vulnerable vessels, took no action that could be interpreted as hostile. The display showed human forces maintaining their positions throughout the Sol system, their weapons powered down, their communications networks quiet except for routine operational traffic. To Coalition observers, it appeared that the humans had decided to allow them to retreat peacefully. Our intelligence analysts interpreted this as confirmation that human capabilities had been exhausted in the previous day's fighting, Kethvar explained. They concluded that the dramatic message was compensation for their inability to prevent our withdrawal. Admiral Zethmorn commended them for recognizing the tactical situation and allowing us to disengage with minimal further casualties. The hologram advanced to show Coalition forces beginning their jump calculations.
hyperdrive systems powering up across the fleet. Standard procedures executed with the precision that had characterized coalition military operations for centuries. Within hours, they would be safely beyond human reach, regrouping in friendly space to plan their next move. The humans waited until our jump calculations were complete, Kethvar said, his voice carrying the weight of inevitable tragedy. Until our hyperdrive systems were fully charged, until our navigation computers had confirmed our exit vectors. They waited until we were at the exact moment of departure. The display showed coalition vessels beginning their hyperspace transition, reality distorting around them as they prepared to slip beyond normal space-time constraints. It should have been routine, the kind of tactical withdrawal that any competent military force could execute under adverse conditions. That's when the humans revealed what they had been building, Kethvar said quietly. The hologram shifted to show the stellar engineering projects human forces had been constructing around their sun. What had appeared to be defensive installations revealed their true nature as the massive structures suddenly activated, focusing stellar energy into coherent beams of impossible intensity. The nickel Dyson lasers weren't designed to destroy ships, Kethvar explained, his voice filled with growing horror. They were designed to destroy space itself, to create localized failures in the fundamental structure of reality that would prevent hyperspace transitions. The display showed the results of this impossible technology. Coalition vessels attempting to jump to hyperspace found themselves trapped as the fabric of space-time itself became unstable around them. Ships that should have translated to faster-than-light travel instead found themselves frozen in a state of perpetual transition, unable to complete their jump but equally unable to return to normal space. We were caught between dimensions, Kethvar said, his scarred hands gripping the podium. Existing partially in normal space and partially in hyperspace, unable to function in either state. Our weapons couldn't fire, our shields couldn't activate, our life support systems began failing as they tried to operate in physics that no longer made sense. The hologram showed coalition crew members struggling with equipment that forgot how to function, breathing atmosphere that occasionally forgot to carry oxygen, and dealing with gravitational fields that randomly changed direction and intensity. But this was only the beginning of their sentence, Kethvar continued, his voice barely above a whisper. The humans had decided we were too dangerous to be allowed to exist, and they had prepared accordingly. The display shifted to show new contacts appearing throughout the Sol system. Not ships emerging from hiding, but constructs that seemed to materialize from nothing, their forms shifting and changing as they approached the trapped coalition fleet. They called them Reapers, Kethvar said, the human word sounding alien and terrible in his voice. Autonomous weapon systems designed for a single purpose, the complete eradication of enemy forces. Not defeat, not capture, not neutralization. Extinction. The hologram zoomed in on one of the approaching constructs, revealing a form that challenged every principle of engineering and physics the Coalition understood. It appeared to be constructed from crystallized death itself, its hull covered in weapons that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Reapers didn't attack our ships, Kethvar explained, his voice filled with unwilling awe. They attacked the concept of our existence. Their weapons didn't destroy matter or energy. They destroyed the information that defined our reality. Ships didn't explode or melt. They were simply edited out of existence as if they had never been built. The display showed coalition vessels vanishing one by one, not in explosions or energy discharges, but in moments of perfect silence as reality rewrote itself to exclude them from the universe's database of existing things. Our crews didn't die, Kethvar said, his voice cracking with the strain of describing the indescribable. Death implies that they had once been alive. The Reapers removed them from causality itself, making it so they had never existed in the first place. Only those of us trapped between dimensions retained any memory of our vanished comrades. General Zixandra made a sound that might have been protest if it hadn't been tinged with growing terror. That's impossible. You can't retroactively erase someone from history. The humans could, Kethvar replied simply. They had weaponized causality itself, turning the flow of cause and effect into a tool for selective deletion of unwanted realities. And they used it with precision that suggested they had been practicing for a very long time. The hologram showed the systematic elimination of coalition forces, each ship vanishing with mechanical precision as the Reapers worked their way through the trapped fleet. No drama, no explosions, no last stands. Just quiet, efficient deletion of everything the coalition represented. This is when we realized that the humans' message hadn't been psychological warfare, Kethvar said, his voice growing steadier as he focused on the military implications. It had been a literal statement of intent. They had put the coalition on trial for the crime of invasion, found us guilty, and were now executing the sentence with judicial precision. The display showed the few coalition vessels that remained, their crews watching in horror as their universe was systematically edited to remove any trace of their civilization's military presence in the Sol system. But the humans weren't finished, Kethvar continued, his voice carrying a new note of absolute despair. The Reapers had eliminated our ships, but the humans had concluded that the threat we represented extended beyond our immediate military forces. The hologram shifted to show long-range sensors detecting movement beyond the Sol system's boundaries. Massive constructs were departing human space, their destinations clearly marked as coalition territory. They had built an invasion fleet, Kethvar said, each word falling like a funeral bell. Not for conquest or colonization, but for the systematic eradication of every coalition installation, every military base, every potential threat to human security throughout the galaxy. The display showed the scope of human preparations. Thousands of ships, each designed for a specific type of target. Orbital installations, planetary defenses, deep space monitoring stations, even civilian infrastructure that could be converted to military use. They called it prophylactic warfare, Kethvar explained, struggling with human concepts that had no equivalent in coalition military doctrine. The preemptive elimination of potential future threats based on the assumption that any species capable of interstellar warfare would eventually become an enemy. Admiral Vrextor's breathing apparatus wheezed with agitation. But surely they couldn't justify such extreme measures based on a single military engagement. The humans had studied our history, Kethvar replied grimly. They had analyzed every coalition military campaign, every species we had integrated, every conflict we had fought. They had concluded that our expansion pattern represented an existential threat to any independent civilization. The hologram showed human intelligence assessments of coalition behavior, complete with detailed analyses of their military doctrine, expansion strategies, and cultural attitudes toward other species. The accuracy was terrifying in its completeness. They saw us as we really were, Kethvar admitted, his voice filled with unwilling honesty. Not as benevolent civilizers bringing order to the galaxy, but as conquerors who offered species the choice between integration and extinction. They realized that our peaceful expansion was simply slow-motion conquest with better marketing. The display showed human strategic projections of coalition behavior, predicting expansion patterns, resource requirements, and military capabilities decades into the future. The analysis painted a picture of inexorable growth that would eventually consume or subjugate every other spacefaring civilization. So they decided to solve the problem permanently, Kethvar said, his voice carrying the finality of a death sentence. Not just to defend themselves from our current invasion, but to eliminate our ability to threaten anyone ever again. The hologram advanced to show human forces departing the Sol system, their destination vectors pointing toward every major coalition installation within 50 light-years. The fleet was massive, organized, and equipped with weapons that could apparently edit reality itself. The fourth day ended with the complete destruction of our invasion force, Kethvar continued, his voice growing hoarse from the strain of recounting the impossible. Of the 6,000 ships that had survived to that point, only 12 remained. Not because we had fought bravely or retreated skillfully, but because the humans had decided that 12 survivors were necessary to carry their message back to coalition space. The display showed the final moments of the fourth day, with the 12 surviving coalition vessels finally completing their hyperspace transition as the reality distortion fields were selectively deactivated around them. As we jumped away, Kethvar said, his voice barely audible, the humans transmitted one final message. Not a threat or a warning, but information. Technical specifications for the weapons they had used against us, complete analysis of our military capabilities, and detailed projections for their upcoming offensive operations. The hologram displayed the human message, its clinical precision more terrifying than any emotional appeal could have been. They wanted us to understand exactly what was coming, Kethvar explained. Not to give us hope of defense or negotiation, but to ensure that we spent our final days fully aware of how thoroughly we had been outmatched. The display faded, leaving the council chamber in emergency lighting that cast harsh shadows across the stunned faces of the assembled military leaders. The fourth day taught us that humans don't just fight wars, Kethvar said, his scarred hands relaxing their grip on the podium. They solve problems. And once they had identified the coalition as a problem that threatened their long-term security, they developed a comprehensive solution. He straightened, drawing upon the last reserves of his professional composure. But our ordeal wasn't over. The fifth day showed us what happens when humans decide that a threat must be eliminated so completely that even the memory of its existence becomes dangerous. The general's four eyes swept across the assembled council members, noting the expressions of growing horror on every face. Prepare yourselves, honored council. What I have described so far was merely the execution of their sentence. The fifth day was when they showed us what human mercy looks like when applied to enemies they consider irredeemable. The fifth day began with silence that stretched across the galaxy itself. General Kethvar stood at the podium, his scarred form appearing smaller and more fragile than before, as if the weight of his final testimony was physically crushing him. The 12 surviving ships of the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet arrived at Zephyr Station 18 hours after fleeing Sol System. Kethvar began, his voice carrying the hollow exhaustion of a being who had seen too much. We expected to find relief, reinforcements, perhaps even hope that the Coalition's superior numbers and technology could mount an effective defense against human retaliation. The holographic display activated, showing the familiar site of Zephyr Station, the Coalition's primary military coordination center. Massive orbital installations surrounded by defensive platforms, communication arrays reaching across galactic distances, and the constant traffic of military vessels that represented the beating heart of Coalition power. Instead, we found chaos. Kethvar continued, his four eyes reflecting memories that still brought him pain. Station Command was receiving reports from across Coalition space of impossible attacks, military installations vanishing without warning, and entire fleets simply ceasing to exist while conducting routine operations. The display shifted to show communication logs from the previous day, reports flooding in from dozens of star systems. The pattern was consistent and terrifying, human forces appearing without warning, engaging Coalition assets with weapons that defied understanding, and disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. The humans hadn't sent a single massive invasion force. Kethvar explained, his voice growing steadier as he focused on tactical details. They had deployed thousands of independent strike teams, each equipped with reality manipulation technology and targeting specific elements of Coalition infrastructure. The hologram showed the scope of human operations, small task forces, rarely more than a dozen ships each, systematically dismantling Coalition military capability across hundreds of light years. They moved with surgical precision, striking at command centers, shipyards, research facilities, and logistics networks. But they weren't conducting random raids, Kethvar said, his voice filled with unwilling admiration. Each attack was part of a comprehensive strategy designed to collapse our entire military structure in a specific sequence. They were dismantling our civilization like engineers deconstructing a machine. The display zoomed in on several attack patterns, revealing the methodical nature of human operations. Communication relays were targeted first, isolating individual systems from mutual support. Then manufacturing facilities, preventing replacement of destroyed equipment. Finally, command structures, leaving surviving forces leaderless and unable to coordinate responses. They had studied our organizational structure more thoroughly than our own analysts, Kethvar admitted, his voice carrying the bitter taste of professional appreciation. Every weakness in our chain of command, every dependency in our supply networks, every single point of failure in our military architecture had been identified and marked for elimination. The hologram showed real-time tactical assessments from the fifth day. Coalition forces attempting to respond to attacks that seemed to anticipate their every move. Defense fleets arrived at threatened systems only to find their targets already destroyed, and human forces vanished. Reinforcements deployed to protect vital installations discovered that the humans had already moved on to secondary objectives. We were fighting an enemy that understood our capabilities better than we understood them ourselves, Kethvar said, his scarred hands gripping the podium. Every tactical manual, every strategic doctrine, every operational procedure we had developed over centuries of warfare had somehow been analyzed, decoded, and turned against us. Admiral Sathara leaned forward, her tentacles writhing with agitation. But how could they have acquired such detailed intelligence about our internal operations? They had been listening, Kethvar replied simply. For decades, possibly centuries, human intelligence operations had been monitoring Coalition communications, studying our military exercises, analyzing our technological development. They knew us better than we knew ourselves, because they had been preparing for war with us since their first contact with faster-than-light travel. The display showed intercepts of human communications during the attacks, revealing a level of detailed planning that bordered on precognition. Strike team commanders discussing Coalition response times with perfect accuracy, weapon systems operators targeting specific vulnerabilities in equipment they had never encountered before, and tactical coordinators predicting coalition behavior with mathematical precision. But the most terrifying aspect of their offensive wasn't the technology or the intelligence. Kethvar continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. It was their efficiency. The humans weren't just destroying our military capability, they were doing it with minimal resource expenditure and no apparent casualties.
The hologram showed human casualty reports from the 5th day's operations.
0 killed, 0 wounded, 0 missing. Perfect execution across hundreds of simultaneous military operations, each one designed to achieve maximum strategic impact while exposing human forces to minimal risk. They had turned warfare into a science, Kethvar said, his voice filled with horrified awe. Not the art of conflict that we understood, not the clash of opposing forces testing each other's strength, but pure problem-solving applied to the elimination of obstacles. The display shifted to show the broader strategic picture, coalition military strength declining exponentially as human forces systematically removed key infrastructure, while human capabilities remained completely intact. It wasn't a war in any sense the coalition understood. It was surgical removal of an unwanted presence. This is when Coalition High Command made its final, desperate decision. Kethvar said, his voice carrying the weight of inevitable tragedy. Faced with the complete collapse of our military structure, they authorized the use of our most terrible weapon. The hologram showed deep space installations throughout Coalition territory, massive constructs that had been hidden in the darkness between stars for centuries. Ancient weapons of such destructive potential that their very existence was known only to the highest levels of government. The Stellar Killers, Kethvar said. And several council members recoiled at the mention of weapons so terrible they were considered myths by most of the military. Planet-sized devices designed to destabilize stars, creating supernovae that would sterilize entire systems. Weapons of absolute last resort, held for threats to civilization itself. The display showed the activation sequences beginning across Coalition space. Ancient technologies stirring to life, weapons that could destroy everything within dozens of light-years charging their exotic power systems for an attack that would render human space uninhabitable for millennia. The plan was simple, Kethvar explained, his voice hollow with the memory of that decision. If we couldn't defeat the humans militarily, we would eliminate them completely. Every star system they controlled, every world they inhabited, every trace of their existence would be burned away in artificial supernovae. The hologram showed targeting solutions being calculated, massive weapon systems aligning themselves with the Sol system and other known human colonies. It would be genocide on an interstellar scale, the complete eradication of human civilization. The Stellar Killers never fired, Kethvar said quietly. The display shifted to show what had happened instead. Human forces had somehow detected the ancient weapons and deployed countermeasures that defied every principle of physics the Coalition understood. The planet-sized installations simply ceased to function, their exotic power systems failing simultaneously across hundreds of star systems. The humans had neutralized weapons that most of our own military didn't know existed, Kethvar said, his voice filled with growing despair. They had somehow developed countermeasures for technology that predated their civilization by millions of years. General Zixagondra made a sound of disbelief. That's impossible. Those installations were built using principles that no current civilization understands. The humans understood them, Kethvar replied grimly. Not just how they worked, but how to stop them from working. They had somehow reverse-engineered technology that we could barely operate, then developed superior alternatives. The hologram showed human technical analysis of the Stellar Killers, complete schematics revealing flaws and vulnerabilities that Coalition engineers had never suspected. The level of understanding displayed was far beyond anything their civilization should have been capable of achieving. That's when we received the humans' final communication, Kethvar said, his voice barely audible. Not transmitted to our military networks or diplomatic channels, but delivered personally to every Coalition citizen throughout the galaxy, directly to individual communication devices, bypassing every security system we had ever developed. The display showed the human message appearing simultaneously on billions of personal communicators, entertainment systems, and information networks throughout Coalition space. The technical achievement of such widespread penetration was staggering in its implications. The message was simple, Kethvar said, and activated the recording. A human voice, speaking with calm authority and perfect Coalition standard. Citizens of the Coalition, your military leadership has been judged and found wanting. Your civilization's expansion through conquest and forced integration ends today. You have 24 hours to implement democratic government, dismantle your military command structure, and begin reparations to species you have subjugated. Compliance will be verified by our monitoring systems. Non-compliance will result in permanent intervention. The recording ended, leaving the council chamber in stunned silence. They had bypassed our entire governmental structure, Kethvar explained, his voice carrying the finality of absolute defeat. Spoken directly to our populations, offering them a choice between freedom from coalition military rule or extinction alongside their leaders.
The hologram showed the results of this impossible communication.
Throughout coalition space, civilian populations began demanding answers from their governments, military personnel questioning their orders, and entire systems declaring independence from central authority. The coalition began collapsing from within, Kethvar said, his scarred hands relaxing their grip on the podium, not because of military defeat, but because the humans had revealed the truth about our expansion methods to the very people we claim to be protecting. The display showed chaos spreading throughout coalition territory, as populations learned about forced integrations, species extinctions, and military campaigns that had been hidden from public knowledge. The carefully maintained fiction of benevolent expansion crumbled under the weight of revealed truth. But this still wasn't the humans' final demonstration. Kethvar continued, his voice growing stronger as he approached the end of his testimony. 24 hours after their ultimatum, they provided proof that compliance was not optional. The hologram showed the fate of systems that had refused to implement the demanded changes, not destroyed by weapons or conquered by invasion, but simply isolated. Cut off from faster-than-light communication, their hyperdrive systems mysteriously failing, their populations trapped in systems that had suddenly become islands in space. The humans had quarantined them, Kethvar explained, his voice filled with unwilling respect. Not destroyed, not occupied, but removed from galactic civilization until they chose to comply with the new order. They had made non-compliance literally impossible by denying access to interstellar technology. The display showed the scope of human intervention. Entire sectors of coalition space had been selectively edited out of the galactic community, their populations healthy and unharmed, but completely unable to project power beyond their home systems. The fifth day ended with the complete transformation of galactic civilization, Kethvar said, his voice carrying the weight of historical conclusion. Not through conquest or destruction, but through the simple application of overwhelming technological superiority and strategic insight. The holographic display faded, leaving the council chamber in emergency lighting that emphasized the profound silence that had fallen over the assembled military leaders. The coalition as we knew it ceased to exist, Kethvar continued, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was describing. Replaced not by human rule, but by the governments our own populations chose, when given accurate information about their situation. He straightened, drawing upon reserves of dignity that had somehow survived the complete collapse of everything he had once served. I stand before you now not as a general of the Coalition Military Command, but as a representative of the Zephyrian Democratic Council, Kethvar said, his four eyes focusing on each member of the assembly. Here to deliver humanity's message to any other species that might consider following our path of expansion through military conquest. The general gestured to the darkened holographic display. The humans are still out there, monitoring galactic civilization, ensuring that the pattern of aggressive expansion that characterized coalition behavior never resurfaces. They have proven that they possess the capability to reshape entire civilizations without firing a shot, to neutralize threats before they fully materialize, and to enforce their vision of galactic order through means that render resistance meaning.